So back in March 2022, when it became apparent that the Russian push for Kiev had failed, it became apparent for many that this war will not end quickly. It will go on for months or years. And why didn't we take the decision back then to increase industrial production? Why didn't we immediately take the decision to send HIMARS, F-16s, MiG-29s immediately from those countries that had them, various types of infantry fighting vehicles and heavy equipment, or for example, cluster munitions, which were sent only a few months ago? Why were we so late, all of us in the West?
There's different reasons for that. For example, with the increase in productions, there's costs associated with that. Governments can't or don't want to do it. Sending Ukraine's weapons, I mean, the reason, for example, that the Americans gave very few HIMARS at the beginning was to assess if the Ukrainians can use them efficiently. And the Ukrainians proved that they can use them extremely efficiently. Even if they just have 18 HIMARS systems and about 10 M270, which is the same system but on tracks, the Ukrainians showed that they can find and hit Russian command posts, artillery positions, with even tanks with those efficiently. So the Americans were like, just 18 are enough. We are amazed. And here you have 12,000, 15,000 rockets. So the Ukrainians are receiving an immense amount of rockets, and it has turned out they don't need much more launchers. The Americans started with a few artillery systems, and then the Ukrainians showed they can really efficiently use the M777 howitzers, and they received more. And right now the Ukrainians have enough equipment. What they need, like they have enough artillery equipment, what they need is more air defense equipment because the country is so huge. And the Russians aren't hitting the frontline troops, they're hitting the cities. And if you want to protect all those cities, you will need 10 Patriot batteries and 20 NASAMS batteries and 10 IRIS-T systems. And the Ukrainians are getting half of that this year and next, but it's not still enough. Poland is buying an immense amount of air defense systems because you understood that you want to protect your cities, you will need it. And the decision was not taken because it was like, can the Ukrainians even use that equipment? Can they integrate it? How do we maintain it? And it has turned out that the Ukrainians can use everything. They can perfectly use it. They find intuitive and new ways to use it. Because the American military was like, can they use a Patriot battery? Yeah, maybe. A week after the Patriot battery arrived, the Ukrainians defeated the most complex missile attack in history with a Patriot system. And the Americans were like, teach us how you did it. We want to know. The Ukrainians are more... Every Western military is right now learning by just looking at the Ukrainians. These are the teachers of modern warfare to everyone in the world right now. The Chinese are watching, the Europeans are watching, and everything we have given the Ukrainians. If we tomorrow give them a nuclear submarine, they will come up with a completely innovative and intelligent way how to use it that nobody has thought about. The drones there's a drone that the Ukrainians turned them into little bombers, and they turned them into anti-tank weapons. All of this is genius ideas. I have a drone. I have a 3D printer. I can make out of hand grenades bombs that I drop with precision on Russians. I saw Ukrainian drone pilots drop hand grenades from 200 meters directly on Russian soldiers' faces. Obviously, they killed them, but the precision and the ingenuity, we all are impressed in the military sphere what the Ukrainians are doing. What they need is more of the heavy equipment because it saves lives. If you're a Ukrainian battalion and you have 30 Abrams tanks, you know your tank crews will survive. If you're a Ukrainian tank battalion and you have T-72 tanks, you know that if the tank is hit, your crew dies.
Yes, we have seen this also in the latest offensive in Zaporizhia, yes. That when the Bradleys, the Marders, infantry fighting vehicles appeared on the front lines, there were cases that they were hit and they were immobilized, but the entire crew survived. Still, large parts of the Ukrainian army are unfortunately equipped with old BMP-1s, so Soviet infantry fighting vehicles from the 1970s. And these, unfortunately, if they get hit, there is practically no chance of survival. So the more of this heavy equipment that is sent, the more Ukrainian soldiers are spared. And I believe that this could be one of the main problems today, that unfortunately the Ukrainian army is not as numerous as the Russians, and that many of the Ukrainian soldiers who have been fighting from February 24th, the ones that are the most experienced, the longer the war goes on, unfortunately, the less and less we can see of them on the front lines.
Yes. We have to go back to the Cold War, because the Soviet doctrine was we make a lot of cheap tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, and we will just throw a mass of them at the NATO forces in case of a war, because even if half of them die, we still have a superiority. We can beat the NATO with just mass, and human lives are worthless for the Soviet state, for the Russian state. And NATO looked at that and said, we need to have equipment that saves our soldiers' lives, because we have fewer, and we need to have better equipment that can withstand attacks and bombings. And so there's two philosophies in what kind of equipment you make. So the Russian equipment is all cheap and garbagey, but it still kills. And the NATO equipment is extremely well protected and high-level quality. But, you know, the Ukrainians have, unlike the Soviet Union, less people, but still the Soviet equipment that costs lives. And the European, what our big error was, we should have begun immediately production in March 2022 with infantry fighting vehicles and tanks to our standards to give to Ukraine. Because if we would have done that, 10,000s of Ukrainian soldiers would still be alive. So we would have to spend money, but we could have saved 10,000s. We didn't. So that amount of dead people is on European governments, because they were like, no, we don't increase production for what the Ukrainians need to save their soldiers' lives, especially infantry fighting vehicle, because a tank has a crew of 4, an infantry vehicle has a crew of 3, but it carries 6 to 8 soldiers in the back into battle, and if that gets hit, you kill 10. So Europeans, by not providing Ukraine more and even better infantry fighting vehicles, we are responsible for some of the Ukrainian losses, and the Europeans don't understand that if you don't want the Ukrainians to win, you will have to send your children.
You also mentioned earlier that if we have a scenario in which we have the Russian army stationed in Belarus and in Western Ukraine, then there would be a second Cold War with tens of thousands of Allied soldiers from Western Europe stationed on the new Iron Curtain, so to say. But at the same time, a lot of people are talking about that it's too expensive to send weapons to Ukraine now. The question is, do they understand how expensive it would be if we would have to spend 4 or 5% of GDP on military expenditure for the next 15, 20, or 30 years in this scenario of a new Cold War? Wouldn't it be better to just invest that money now over the next 3-4 years and make sure that Ukraine manages to either hold the Russians back, or naturally even better, to push them all the way back to the borders of 1991?
Absolutely. The NATO goal of 2% isn't a percentage that enables you to fight a war. 2% of GDP, as NATO suggests, is enough to maintain all abilities and capabilities. If you feel threatened or you want to wage war, 3.5%, like the United States spends around 3.5%, is the amount you have to spend of GDP to be able to have the mass and capabilities and capacities and industrial base to fight a war. Poland is going to spend about 4% because it's threatened. So in the Cold War, the West spent between 3 to 5% in nations because they were threatened. If you spend above 5%, you are on a war footing. You want to invade others. You want to butcher your way to victory. Guess what? The Russians are spending more than 20%. And not just this year, the Russians began to spend more than 20% in 2018. So the Russians from then began to prepare for invasions of other countries. So if someone says, yeah, but the Germans, 1.5%, they're spending that, and it's a maximum they can spend. You spend more for your police, Germans. How about getting serious? 2% is the absolute base minimum. 3%, you will be safe. 4%, you can go on the offensive and crush the enemy before he crushes you. Look at Israel, 4.4, sorry.